Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to present to you today Professor Jennifer Van Hook, who is Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Demography at the Pennsylvania State University and Non-Resident Fellow at the Migration Policy Institute. Her research focuses on the demographics of immigrant populations and the socioeconomic integration of immigrants and their children. She has published research on the size, characteristics, and dynamics of the unauthorized foreign-born population. She also has ongoing research projects that focus on the relationship between immigrant legal status and the health and well-being of immigrants and their children. She is co-authoring a book with James Bachmeyer entitled Texas-Style Exclusion, Mexican Americans and the Legacy of Limited Opportunity, which focuses on the educational integration of Mexican immigrants and their children and grandchildren across the 20th century. Dr. Van Hook received her PhD in sociology from the University of Texas, Austin, and today's presentation is titled The Population Dynamics and Demographic Impact of the Unauthorized Immigrant Population in the United States. So with that, I'll pass it off to you, Professor Van Hook, and thank you.
Okay. Thank you all for inviting me to come to this workshop and talk about my most recent work. What you're going to hear today are just some thoughts that I have in terms of how we can sort of push the envelope in terms of what we know, not only just about the stocks of the unauthorized immigrant population, but also the dynamics and what can we gather simply by looking at some of our more traditional data sources, the American Community Survey for the most part. And so this presentation was also presented this spring at the PAA. And I just want to thank Matt Hall for he was a discussant on this paper. He gave me a few more ideas, which I've now included in this presentation. So I'll just start with a little bit of background. You all were there for Jeff Passell's presentation earlier today. Because of a lot of what Jeff's done in his work, we do know a lot about the unauthorized foreign-born stock, the population estimates, especially in the United States. A lot of this work that's been done by Pew, MPI, DHS, has really shown a lot of consistent findings about the trends in the size and the composition of this population. And so, for example, we know, and everybody agrees, that the overall population size has been fairly steady since about 2010, after the recession. We also know that the share of undocumented immigrants from Mexico has been in decline ever since the Great Recession. We also know that the numbers of undocumented immigrants originating from Central America, Asia, also Jeff mentioned earlier this morning, Venezuela, all of that has been increasing, and some of it very quickly in just the last couple of years. And so overall, what we're seeing is, there's a growing number of immigrants coming from sort of these or new origins. So there's just been this proliferation of diversity of origins in recent years. We also have heard a lot about border surges, and this is not just in the news, it's actually in the data, and you can see it here in this chart. This is the number of monthly migrant encounters at the US-Mexico border, and there has been some dramatic changes in that number over time, and you can see that in the data that we're sort of at an all-time high in terms of border encounters. What does that then mean, though, in terms of the rest of the population? And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at here today. Now, my data does not go as far, it does not really pick up this most recent surge in border crossings, but I'm going to still try to take a step back and think, what can we know then about population dynamics? It's more than just who comes in, but it's also how long people stay, how many people leave, who leaves, and the ages at which they're spending their lives as living as undocumented immigrants in the country. And so that's sort of what I'm trying to get at here with this set of analyses. We know, for example, from Doug Massey's work with the migration, the Mexican Migration Project data that he collected over many decades and published some books and lots of articles on, is that population dynamics are really important for understanding the impact and the accumulation of the undocumented immigrant population. And what he documented for Mexicans is that originally a lot of the migration from Mexico had been circular in its character, and the duration of stay was pretty short. And then with the increase in border enforcement and to some degree interior border enforcement, but mostly border enforcement, duration of stay has increased for the Mexican and to some extent Central American population, leading to an accumulation of the size of the population. And so this has had all kinds of implications for raising children. So now instead of raising children across borders with border in between, more and more, at least according to Massey's work, starting around 2000, there was an increase in the number of families that were being raised, children being raised on the US side of the border. And so now we have the phenomenon of children being raised by undocumented immigrants and all of the implications that that has for their health, their well-being, their access to resources, and so forth. Okay, so this is like just sort of giving a lot of credit to Doug Massey for documenting this and how important, like really demonstrating how important population dynamics are. But that said, we don't know a lot about the other new and growing origin groups. Okay, so just put a pin in that for now. And now I'm just going to talk a little bit about, how it is that we can use our basic sort of demographic concepts from formal demography and apply it to this population. And now setting aside the issue of like social impact or economic impact, I think there's something to be said for demographic impact. And here I'm just thinking of a very simple measure of sort of the demographic footprint of a population. And at its most basic level, I think you can think of it as a function of the duration of time an average immigrant stays in the country, and especially stays as an undocumented status, and the size of the inflows. So duration of stay in this sense is what I'm thinking of is the expected years lived as in unauthorized status. And so if you want to go to a formal definition, it's like a life expectancy, only we're only counting the years lived in undocumented status. And we just divide that T0 in the numerator there by the number of entrants in each. If you were to think of this as a life table function, this would be like the L0, the little L0 column in a life table. But here we're just counting the number of people who enter undocumented status each year in the stationary population. Now, the annual inflow is a number that would come from the real population, and that would just be a count of the number of people entering undocumented status each year. And it functions a lot like a scale factor. So then here, if we multiply these two together, the duration of stay by the annual inflow, this is where you get at and sort of derive this this concept that I'm trying to develop here of demographic impact. And so what it really is, it's the size of the stationary unauthorized population, but scaled to size for each year. So that's one way of thinking about demographic impact. Another way, and this is only just for the people who are living their lives as the immigrants who are living their lives as undocumented immigrants. But there's another dimension of this, and that's in the next generation. And so another possible measure of demographic impact would be something akin to a net reproduction rate. So here I'm just calling it this NRR. And here, this is a function of the duration and timing in which undocumented immigrants are spending their lives in that status and the fertility that occurs while they're in that status. So here, this NRR is defined as the expected number of female births to unauthorized entrants while still in that unauthorized status, assuming all current exit and death rates in the population. And so here's a more formal sort of way to write this. Here again, using our life table functions, where X here is 5-year age groups, ranging from 15 to 45. So that covers the reproductively active ages of people's lives. The big LX here is the number of person years lived in unauthorized status by women ages X to X plus 5. Entrants, that's the number of female unauthorized entrants into the stationary population. And then MX here is not a mortality rate. It's a age-specific fertility rate for female births only. So you put that all together, it's just exactly analogous to a regular NRR, but this is just for this particular population. And then just to spin this out even a little bit more, we can multiply that NRR by a couple of factors in order to get the expected US-born children of unauthorized parents. And so this is a really important population because of all the ways that we understand immigration status of parents to impact children's outcomes, including the US-born children of those parents. And so here we can just multiply the annual inflow by the NRR and then to expand it to include both male and female children, it would be multiplied by 2.04. So that's just sort of the theory and what I'm trying to kind of play with here. It all sounds great in theory, I think it makes sense in theory, but then how do we actually estimate this in the data? And so here I'm going to draw upon some of the data and methods that Jeff talked about earlier. And I'll start here. What I'm starting here with is the Migration Policy Institute has a series of estimates of the unauthorized immigrant population, and these estimates run from 2000 to 2022. And it's broken down not just by year and country of birth, but also by birth cohort and by year of entry. And so we can put together cohorts for these. And so what I can do is I can take that data, and if you can imagine sort of taking a data set and flipping it so that you could follow cohorts when they enter, over time, and as they age. And so we do this for all of the different cohorts in the data. And then I can look at the cohorts, and I'll show you a picture in a minute of what this looks like. And we can calculate the number who enter undocumented status each year. And then we can also look at the subsequent changes in the sizes of those cohorts to estimate a net exit rate from those populations. And then you can use those estimates then to assemble all of the components that you need to create these life table estimates that I just described. So, so here's a nice picture here. So this is an example of a cohort of undocumented immigrants who arrived from Mexico in 2005, ages 15 to 29. And here I'm just combining a bunch of birth cohorts together just to illustrate how this looks. And I believe all of these are male in this example. So what we see here is that as you follow the cohort over time, and that the bottom axis is duration of residence measured in years. And then the y-axis is the size of the cohort. And so what you can see is the cohort builds a little bit over the first couple of years. And what's happening is that there's an initial inflow of newly arrived unauthorized immigrants in that first year. But then there is an augmentation of that. It increases even further as some people were initially, maybe it's measurement error, but I think also there's also some people who overstayed their visa. So they might have come on a temporary visa and then overstayed. And so you end up seeing an increase in the size of the undocumented population at first, but then after that point, you see a very steady decline. And now, to be fair and to be honest about this is smoothed. And so we end up seeing some smoothing in this, in these estimates, that they do look quite smooth, but you do see sort of a steady decline. Very, very rarely do you see any increase after that initial buildup of the cohort. Now I'm going to also show you a different one. This is India. And so these are immigrants coming from India. And what's different about this population is that the vast majority of the undocumented immigrants from India originally came on some kind of legal non-immigrant visa. And then they subsequently overstayed that visa. And so you can see that the undocumented immigrant population has a very different shape to it by duration of residence, because initially there's not that many undocumented immigrants. Most of them are in this gray area here where they have a legal non-immigrant visa. But then over time, some of those visas, they expire, and some of them stay anyway. And so then they join the undocumented population. And then finally, after about 8 or 9 years, you start to see decline in the population. And so as the population declines, some of them have died, some of them have legalized, some of them have returned. I don't necessarily know all of the differences, like exactly how or why they exited the population, but we do see evidence of some exits. So let's see, what time is it? Okay, I got 15 minutes. So this is what it looks like when I reassemble the data and put it back into the original form, but now I have entries and exits broken out. And so when the bars go below the line, that's net out migration. When the bars go above the line, the green, that's in migration. And then the light green are what I think of as maybe they're likely visa overstays. I'm not exactly sure, because there might be more visa overstays than what I show here. But that's, to the best of my knowledge, that's what's happening there. The red line is the net change in the size of the population. So you can see here, right around 2007, 2008, there's this giant decline where lots of people have left the population. So all those cohorts had dramatic drops in their sizes right around that year. We see this for every single group that we examined. And then recent years, we're starting to see an increase in the size of the population. So this is for all undocumented immigrants from all origins. When we look at it for Mexico, you can see, if you look at the red line here, after the Great Recession, and there was this dramatic return migration, it looks like, they never recovered a sort of a positive inflow. And so the size of that population dropped pretty steadily since 2007. Okay, so I'm going to move on. This was our other estimate. This is the estimate of the expected duration in unauthorized status among these different groups. And what's interesting here is The colored bars here show the number of years spent as undocumented immigrants. The gray bar is the sum of the time that they spent as undocumented plus the time that they spent before they became undocumented as legal non-immigrants. And so you can add those two up together to get sort of the total length of time that they spent in the country. What's noticeable here is that, first of all, there's a lot of variation in the duration of time spent as undocumented. It's perhaps highest for the immigrants coming from Mexico and Central America. It's also very high for immigrants coming from Venezuela, where there's very, very low rates of return migration. You also see, like for some of these countries, like from Europe, pretty low expected durations as undocumented, and they also have a very high number of years spent in the country as not undocumented, like as a student or as a legal temporary worker or something like that. And so these people really look like this is a pattern that looks like a group with a lot of visa overstays and a group that doesn't necessarily spend their whole lives in the United States as living as undocumented immigrants. Maybe they found another route to legalize, or maybe they just left. And it's hard for me to say for sure what happened to them, but their experiences living as undocumented immigrants is quite different than it is for these Central Americans, Mexicans groups. Here is a graph showing the changes in what I calculated as the demographic impact or the footprint of these groups. And the number one thing that you can really see here is the decline in that demographic impact for immigrants from Mexico. And that's really because of the decline in the number of entrants from Mexico, undocumented entrants. That's really gone down quite a lot. There's not been a lot of change in their expected duration of residence. It's just been a big decline in the number of entrants. Here is, I'm just gonna walk through this. My calculation of the net reproduction rate for undocumented immigrants by country. And just for reference, I put the like for the NRR for the US born right there along the top in the gray line. And so what you can see here, this is just really interesting because it's not just a function of fertility, but it's a function of age at arrival. So like the immigrants from Central America, especially Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, they tend to arrive as younger. So you probably have heard a lot about childhood arrivals. And the childhood arrival rate from Guatemala, for example, is one of the highest among all of these sending countries. And therefore, they're expected to spend a larger share of their reproductive lives living in undocumented status. And so they're much more likely to have children while being undocumented parents in their lives in the United States. And so again, this is just another indicator of how we could use demography, right, to kind of figure out how many children are really put at risk of having undocumented parents and not having access to the same kinds of resources that their peers might have had. And a lot of it has to do with these underlying dynamics. So, and then finally, this is a chart showing the expected US-born children, number of US-born children in that stationary population for each year. And so, yeah, you can see the gigantic decline for Mexico. Currently, right now, the risk of having, like the numbers of undocumented children expected from undocumented immigrants from Central America has exceeded the numbers from Mexico, even though it's a numerically smaller group. And that just has to do with their age of arrival. So, So what can we get from all of this? I'm happy to have a discussion. I would say, first of all, these kinds of estimates are very much experimental in my view. I've been just tinkering with these ideas, but I think when I think about it, it's really important to go beyond just stocks and surges when we think about, oh, what's the undocumented immigrant population and what is its impact on society and what's its impact on the lives of the immigrants themselves. And it's very important to then consider, not only just the numbers here, but how long they're spending in different statuses, what parts of their lives are they spending in these statuses, what impact does that then have on the next generation. So, when I think about sort of the broad brush kind of patterns that we're seeing here, it seems like there's three pretty large groups to think about here. And so one group is probably had a very high demographic impact, but it's declining. And I would put Mexico in that group. And it's really important to understand that Mexico is experiencing a rapidly declining pattern of labor migration. And in fact, it's being replaced by a pattern in which this group is aging in place in the United States. And pretty soon we're going to see a very rapid increase in the older undocumented Mexican population who's entering older ages without the kind of safety net that most older adults tend to expect in the United States, like Social Security and Medicaid. There's a second group where I feel like we're seeing some signs of increasing impact, and this would be the immigrants coming from Venezuela, Central America. And a lot of these, like Jeff was mentioning, growing numbers are coming under these humanitarian statuses like TPS, or they have asylum claims that have not been resolved. And a lot of these people, they come at all ages, but there's a lot of children among them, children and adolescents. And so given that the return migration rates appear to be quite low for immigrants coming from these countries, they are expected, if we don't see a lot of changes in the next 10, 20 years, they're expected to live out their lives, and especially the reproductive aged parts of their life course in the United States, and struggling with some of the undocumented statuses that we all are aware of. And then a third group, which I would say sort of has lower demographic impact for now, and I put in parentheses for now because I don't know what's going to happen. And these would be some of these other regions. And there is a growth of undocumented immigration from Europe and Canada and Africa. A lot of these people seem to be visa overstayers. And it might be because there's a mismatch of labor demand with sort of the number of slots available or demand for this kind of labor. But they don't seem at this point to stay very long, or they don't seem to be remaining in undocumented status for significant periods of their life course, like the other two groups. So, and I think I'll just quit my screen in case you guys have questions. So.
Thank you so much. Questions? We have yeah, Elizabeth.
I'm wondering, so the NRR for unauthorized immigrants, does that take into account if a woman, for instance, had a child before she immigrated to the US?
No, it only counts the number of US born children. I didn't count the before migration because I figured they would be counted as the migrants themselves if they came with her.
Yeah.
Hi, I have a question beyond the numbers that of the books at the end, and I was wondering, you had a graph where you had the like a bar chart and then a line with the red line that shows the net migration.
I can't
And-
hear you.
Oh.
Can you speak a little louder?
Sure. If I'm here, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So you have this graph with a bar chart and then the red line that shows the net migration. And there was a big drop in 2008, which I assume was driven by the recession. But
Yeah.
then what's really surprising is that after about 2000, maybe 12, it's fairly stable. It doesn't seem like either the policies under the Trump administration or the COVID pandemic had much impact. How do you explain that?
There just wasn't a lot of new migrants coming from Mexico since 2007. There's a lot of theories out there about why that migration was halted virtually halted. And so, like there was less demand in Mexico because fertility had fallen so much, or there was an increase in opportunities, economic opportunities in urban areas in Mexico since the stabilization of the peso. There's just a lot of theories out there about what happened, but there just wasn't a lot of new migration from Mexico since that time. And that's the reason why it just hasn't changed. And so what's left is the immigrants who are living here now, right? So there was still a lot of Mexican immigrants remaining in the United States in 2007. And what happened, they got older. And so when they get older, they don't have children, right? Because they've gone beyond reproductive age. And so you end up having a rapidly aging population. Does that make sense?
One last question. Okay, thank you so much.